Okay, today we're going to talk about Plato's Republic, Book 9. It's not going to be a very long video. I want to cover some the basics of Book 9, but I think also now that we've been working through the Republic for such a long time now, I think that we can go ahead and look at some systematic things. I think Book 8 and Book 9, by the way, are both really good applications of Plato's theory. So I think you can actually get some good, more familiarity with Plato's metaphysics and not just with his politics and psychology. So let's go then to the slides. As I say, I don't intend for this one to be terribly long. Come on, what are you doing? There we go. And let's get rid of that. Okay. So, right. So the Tears of the Tyrant, that is, as you'll recall, at the beginning of the Republic, the story is set. It's very similar, I think, to the story of Job that we get in the Bible. That is, the question that is put to Socrates is, well, say this person, you say that the person with the just soul is the happiest person, and the person with the most unjust soul would be the least happy person. So, but you have to prove that. You have to prove that to us. So let's make a test case. Let's assume that the person with the unjust soul has, and I think we can probably go on to the slide now. Yeah, this is the third bullet point on the slide. The person with, let's say that the person with the just soul has nothing, including no respect from anyone. Everyone thinks they're dishonorable. They have no place in society. So they have no honor or anything like that. And in addition, they have, because worldly goods, after all, isn't just money. Worldly goods is also stuff like reputation and social status and so on. So we'll take all that kind of stuff away from the just person, and we'll give the unjust person all that stuff. We'll make the unjust person fabulously prosperous in any material or social level. And the challenge set to Socrates in this conversation of the Republic is, well, show us then that this just person, as you describe them, are actually going to be happier than what you're calling the unjust person, because it's certainly not obvious, Socrates. So that's sort of it. And here in Book 9 is really where we're finally going to get the answer to that. We've been getting the answer to that all along, because the whole Republic has been telling us about this distinction. Let me just go through in an introductory way, because this is, after all, for students of the book, this PowerPoint here. Each book of the Republic was written about 375. It relates events from about 20, 25 years earlier, shortly after the defeat of the Athenians by the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War. Plato is an incredible composer. It's, he doesn't know that he's Plato, and he doesn't know that he's what we today would call a philosopher. He's writing these moralistic stories. They are populated with real historical figures. People from Plato's family, his brothers are in there, his uncles are in there, as well as everybody else in these dialogues are real people, but people placed in fictional situations or semi-fictional situations. So what are we reading here? I mean, I think we really need to open our minds when we're reading Plato's dialogues, because usually they're presented to us in philosophy context. And so we think, well, they're these philosophy texts. And then what we get is a sort of march through the arguments. Well, here's the 4 arguments, and you're supposed to learn the arguments. And that's not exactly the right way. We have to open our minds. And in this case, I think in Book 9, we can really see sort of the big picture of Plato. All right, so second bullet point, then just sort of locating ourselves in the text, Book 6 and 7, sort of the climactic parts of the text, the end of Book 6 with the analogies of the sun and the divided line, and the beginning of Book 7 with the famous analogy of the cave. And this kind of completes the discussion of the training of what I'll call the philosopher king, whatever you want. So we've got that, right? And we understand that what they do is they contemplate universals, they contemplate the good. So this is what is described to us during the rest of Book 7 after we get this statement of the philosophy. Um, then we get books 8 and 9. And as I say, books 8 and 9 then are applications of the theory that's been developed throughout the previous parts of the book to this question, the question about the just and unjust man and their relative happiness, and to analysis of both the psyche and the polis as well, ongoing. So, and again, in third bullet point, this is the book that settles the issue. The last thing I want to say, that last bullet point there on the slide, is that fancy word. It actually comes from religious studies. That word is soteriological. But the reason that I put it in there is because another thing that we often miss about these ancient Greek texts, one is that we try to classify them as philosophy or as something else in these categories that we have today. But another thing that we do is we forget that we read them in a sort of passive, modern, sort of Cartesian, if I may say so, sort of way. Soteriological means these texts teach and present a certain kind of discipline and practice. And if you follow this discipline and practice, then your life will get better, which is why it's often said about ancient writings that they concentrate on what it is to lead the good life, because they do. And that is something that modern philosophy, which is very sort of technical and specialized, has lost. But we can, but again, that concept philosophy isn't doing us any good there. Forget that. Don't decide whether you're a philosopher or not. So it's meant to be a discipline leading to a greater life. Some have even suggested that the Republic was meant to be a textbook to train the philosophers in the way that's described in the end of book 7. So, okay, so there we are. And again, as I was explaining in the video about book 8, then you have this form-matter distinction, the rise of matter into form and out of form. And Plato does not, repeat not, a la Descartes and the modern tradition, sort of magically separate human beings from the rest of the cosmos that way. His analysis of human psychology and human political structures is exactly, not similar, it's exactly the same analysis as his analysis as to where tables and chairs or parrots and peacocks come from. All right, and he starts off with, I think, a really interesting reality check. Something that impresses me about Plato, and this has been said many times before, in fact, it's a famous statement about him by, I think, Whitehead. He really seems to anticipate a great many issues in philosophy that characterize philosophy after that and right up to this day. And he gives us a little really basic bit of ethical theory here. He says, look, if you're, because what are we doing here? We're doing something like the metaphysics of value. Where does value come from? What makes things good or bad? That's really the question. And so he wants to say, well, if you say that it's just pleasure, just sort of, for example, pleasant sensation, pleasures of the body, material pleasures, then there's no limit on that. I mean, if you say that's what makes something good, then the more pleasurable that thing is to you, then by definition, the better that is. And one problem here is it's hedonistic, and we call that ethical hedonism. Now, there are two issues here with ethical hedonism. One is it true to say that ultimately for human beings, the good just is whatever sort of feels good for human beings, and that's entirely contingent, entirely a matter of context and perspective, and such that in reality, there really is nothing that underlying fact about what's good or bad. And this again is this Ionian, Protagorean, Heraclitean view of the material world. Now, Socrates points out that if that's your theory, you say, well, yeah, we do experience some things as good and bad. But the reason we experience anything at all as good and bad is because it causes pleasant or bad experiences. The quality of our experience is good or bad. And again, the point, there are a lot of things to say about that, but the point that Plato makes early on in book 9 is, then you say that's good. So a subject is feeling better, getting more pleasure out of something, X. And so you say that's the source of value. So there's no limit on that. There's no cap on that. And he's just making an appeal to common sense. Second bullet point on the slide. He says, look, when we're sleeping, we might think of crazy things. When we're dreaming, we might dream about murdering someone. We might have a dream about sleeping with our mother. Again, remember Oedipus and Sophocles in the Oedipus trilogy here, of which Socrates is very, very, very aware because the mainstay of their culture is theater. And so we have these unthinkable thoughts and the unsayable things to say, and they come to us, and we all have that nature. He's very interesting. He does seem to understand the unconscious. He does seem to give a pretty good hint here that he understands notions of, for example, repression. He says, but there are people who really do just keep acting out on what seem to them to be their material pleasures. We have such people, and they're these ghoulish people. They're outlaws, they're killers, they're temple robbers, they're the worst kind of scum. And so he gives a little reality check, says, I'll talk with you guys about this, that you seem to think that maybe pleasures of the body are the source of value. I'm willing to talk to you about it, but, really, when we look at that, it's pretty easy to see that the people who are actually all the way gone into satisfying the cravings of the body are sort of really not only not good, but really the worst kind of people. This is something about Plato. Of course, I'm not an apologist for Plato. I'm not here to convince everyone that Plato's right. What we want to do is understand Plato's thinking. But Plato has this form-matter duality, and he thinks form, the formal organization of the cosmos, the mathematical structure of the cosmos, is the source of value, the fact that the universe is an organized place. And he wants that value to be objective and to be built into the fabric of the universe, because he doesn't like this moral relativism, which is really a kind of nihilism that he finds amongst these new naturalists. So, but this is a problem. When we look at Plato, and Plato, of course, a great forerunner of the Abrahamic monotheistic traditions, basically Judaism and Platonism combined, and you get Christianity and Islam, really. I mean, that's a really basic formula there. And so we see something here that we can, it's immediately recognizable, and we might not be entirely sympathetic to, depending on who we are, or what we are. But, Plato, after all, doesn't like the body very much. And this is the reason why we react against Plato, I think, in the modern world. This is Nietzsche's reaction against Plato. He doesn't like the body, and he equates the body with irrationality. He doesn't like irrationality either. And a great deal of then modern philosophy, 20th century art, has been sort of this to use Nietzsche's terms, revaluation, and seeing the irrational side of human nature and the animal side of human nature is something to be valued, at least. It's not bad. It's not debased. It's not shameful and grotesque. And, so this is this kind of very conservative side of Plato. What is it? He just thinks that value comes from form, from symmetry, from mathematical organization. That's the only thing those are the universal things that bind everything together into a kind of oneness. And coming to understand that is just what enlightenment is, which I would point out is also pretty much exactly what Indian teaching at the same time teaches us, that everything is a oneness. So the dark side of Plato then, and raises some questions to put to him in the last bullet point on the slide. First of all, he has basically a negative view of human nature. And this is a really important thing to consider when we're reading philosophers. Thomas Hobbes has a very negative view of human nature. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a very positive view of human nature, innate human nature. They both are social contract theorists, but it's important to understand the starting attitude towards human nature. You want to ask that question, does John Stuart Mill have a positive or a negative? Does Karl Marx have a positive or negative view of human nature? Sigmund Freud, you want to ask that about the people that you're reading. So, and Plato, after all, has to be said, thinks that to the extent that human beings are animals and part of the animal material world, then they're based. It's the original sin, to be incarnate. That just literally is the sin of the flesh. It's not, the sin of the flesh is not doing what. The sin of the flesh is being an animal in nature, with irrational and irresistible cravings and drives. And Plato doesn't like it. So, one question we might ask then, two questions there in that one, we could say, well, don't rational people do evil? Isn't Dr. No evil? Wasn't Hitler really smart? That kind of stuff. Plato actually thinks they don't. Plato actually thinks that anyone who actually is um, enlightened by virtue of studying the universals and seeing the commonalities that bind the cosmos together into an ordered place where value is possible. And he actually thinks, I think he thinks that remember, it's soteriological, it's about changing your life. He doesn't believe that you could know about that and appreciate it and not be transformed in terms of your comportment, and perhaps even in terms of your body itself. He doesn't like doctors. So Plato thinks rational people, what he means by rationally enlightened people, could not do evil. It seems at first as if maybe that's just some sort of primitive caveman kind of psychology that he's got or something, but it's not. He's very sophisticated about psychology. No, he's actually got a reasonable argument. I don't know if the argument goes through but that's because it's so deep and broad. I mean, the question is, could an enlightened person still do wrong things or bad things? What's the definition of enlightenment? And the other one, the second point there in the last bullet point is, might altruism be a passion? That is, here's another thing about Plato to notice in terms of his ethical theory. He thinks that hedonism, the view that value comes from pleasures, physical pleasures, ultimately, and egoism, the view that the only legitimate recipient of my moral concern is myself. He thinks those two things go together, because he thinks that concentrating on the quality of your experience as the one thing that you care about, whether your experiences are these sort of essentially good or bad experiences, he thinks just is identical to only caring about yourself, which again turns out to be a much deeper view than it appears at first. But it's not obviously the right view. David Hume, the great empiricist philosopher of the 18th century, tells us that there are moral sentiments. There is a moral sentiment. He says, Mother Nature has endowed us with this moral sentiment. I know not where it comes from, because Hume doesn't want it to be rationalist. And Hume is quite prescient in that, because it's 100 years later that Charles Darwin starts giving us the tools to understand how that could be. But Plato, as I say, it looks to me as if with Plato, he thinks, and it's a deep view. Look, he thinks, since my world is this world of my experiences, the experiences that I'm having, because I have this contingent body and living in this contingent life, then I'm that little microcosm. It's like a solipsistic position, and so if all I value is the quality of my experience, then he thinks the equivocation is, he thinks then you don't care about the quality of other people's experiences, and it doesn't follow. So the distinction that we want to make is, you can be an ethical hedonist, but you could also be an altruist, and Plato seems to think that's not possible. But I can think that I just want to arrange things for the benefit of all humankind, and I can still be a hedonist who believes that what that would be arranging things so that most people are, this is an argument in utilitarianism, would be happy. So, okay, so very interesting. And now let's go to these basic teachings. If you go on the internet and start just looking up Republic Book 9, you're going to be told, well, there are these three arguments. There aren't actually three arguments. By their standard of argument, there's maybe like five, but actually there's really only one argument, which just is the basic teaching, which is just run at in various different ways. But by book 9, he's just spent this text, all these other books before it, giving us these tools that we need to see why it is that the tyrant is not going to be as happy a person as the philosopher. Now we still, though, want to see if he's persuasive, and I think we can go through the three different points that are called three different arguments, and we can see whether this is persuasive. The thing is, I often want to say this in teaching philosophy, teaching Plato to newcomers or people who just new to studying philosophy is something like this, that you can read it. Sometimes undergraduates who aren't particularly interested and have to take the class or something like that will read Plato as rhetoric. It's like looking at a beautiful painting, which we also do in my classes. And you're sort of, oh, lovers of truth, you know, who would die for the truth. And isn't that all very beautiful? And isn't that all very inspiring? And that's why we like it. That's why we think it's great art. Like we like a big Baroque painting because it's, you know, and that's not it at all. There's arguments here. There's arguments that you can contend with. He's not on some plane above you. You're not on some plane above him either. You know, we can look at what he says and we can ask ourselves, well, is he persuasive? He's persuasive on some points and not on others. You know, I've already pointed out the really big enchilada here, which is that he's down on physicality and being a physical being. Most people in our age are not going to think that's a very, at least most people in our, what are we, sort of Western context. Islam, agree with that. All right. Now, something that's missed about Plato, maybe it's a Cold War thing, maybe we're uncomfortable with Plato. Plato's really against materialism. Plato starts out the Republic by saying everything was fine until the people got too fat and happy and involved in material things, start taking other people's land. That's why there's war. You know, and he is a communist. When I say he's a communist in his political theory in the Republic, I don't mean to push people's buttons, oh, it's so great, oh, it's so bad. I just think if you're asking me as someone who does social and political theory, if I had to characterize what we were looking at there, particularly say in book 5, he's a communist, for better or for worse. But if you just want to know what kind of thinking it is, that's what kind of thinking it is. So we miss that. I think perhaps in the United States or in English-speaking context, maybe we're a little uncomfortable with just how communistic he really is, but he is. Now, bullet point 2, by far the most operative claim. The central claim here, the thing that's really pretty much running everything, everything's being run by the form-matter distinction and his discussion of the metaphysics of form and matter. And our material body is the form. And our material body is coming to be and passing away. And like everything that comes to be and passing away, it is involved in the world of the many, the world of the opposites. I am both older and younger. I am both hotter and colder. And so by far the most operative claim here is that our material body, which is a state of becoming and passing away, involves us in these physical desires and aversions, which can take over our lives. We suffer because we have a body and we're involved in the physical world. And remember, he's already made it very, very clear that there's a dialectic between the actual nature of the person and the nature of the world they're in and the life that they're living. So, you know, it's not, again, there's no Cartesianism here. There's no independent soul that's detached and kind of looking on from a distance. Everything is dynamic. So third bullet point, you know, basic, again, look at this is really basic Asian teaching. The rational soul, right, is attached to this body. The body just wants to satisfy its cravings. And even, you know, you can even feel this in sort of ordinary middle-class existence. What, am I the first person to point this out? You know, you got to get in the car, and why? Because you got to go buy some more gas to put in the car so you can drive around some more. You know, you got to get the money, honey. You know, it's all that. And so, yeah, to some extent, in these physical forms, we are yoked to the physical world. And Socrates teaches, as Siddhartha Gautama teaches, that, you know, we have to take care of ourselves. We have to take care of that side of our existence. But to be stuck to a body that is only involved in craving and satisfaction is nothing but sheer slavery and torture to a rational soul that understands that there are transcendental truths. As I was saying before, here's where I discussed it in the last bullet point, these passionate motives are entirely selfish. So now this is a sort of sub-argument. As I said, there's actually several arguments here, more than 3 anyway. The tyrant has only enemies. The tyrant doesn't have any friends. So the tyrant is outside of society. lacking all of the benefits and even human needs that society provides. And not only that, but society to the tyrant is a bad thing. The tyrant's always worried that the people are going to come and kill him. So the creature of pleasure, to the degree that that's what they are, lacks community. To the degree he thinks that to the degree that you're a creature of pleasure and you're sort of chasing a buzz or something, to that degree, you're not acting as a member of the community, which is something to think about. The community is the disunited swarm from aristocracy down to tyranny, that chain of different kinds of government that we looked at when we were talking about book 8. Anything much below timarchy, anything to the divided line of oligarchy and below, in some sense, isn't really a polis at all, because a polis has some kind of unity, has some sort of organization. But if the motive is actually physical motives, then again, according to Plato's analysis, that's not really a society at all. Again, you see that like a sphere, the matter rises up into form and it becomes a good sphere, a smooth, true sphere. And then it falls back down and slowly loses it, gets oblate eventually. It's not any kind of circular thing at all. A human psyche, a human polis, rise up. And there's one point where they really are something close to what we're calling them, and the rest of it's, going back down into passing away. There's a phenomenal argument here. This is an interesting question in the Republic that Glaucon and his brother Adimantus, these are the two older brothers of Plato, who are present in the dialogue, are asking Socrates about, because again, think about this question that we're asking about hedonism. I like to eat the chocolate, right? And the reason that I like to eat the chocolate is because of the way it feels, that taste that I get when I put the chocolate in my mouth. That's why I like the chocolate. So, and that's an example of a physical good, a physical pleasure. There are more healthy ones. I mean, if I'm running and I just finished a really good run, then I also might feel really, really good. That's a physical good, a physical pleasure, because I'm in a body. And so those are what we call first order values. This is a question in environmental ethics. First order values, that is something that I value just in and of itself. I don't value eating chocolate for any other reason. I just like to eat it just because it feels good in this body. And notice also that's quite contingent. There just didn't have to be this body, and there didn't have to be chocolate. There just is. So the second bullet point then, it's one thing to be persuaded, I think fairly easily persuaded, that just comportment and a just state of mind is going to be a good second order value. That is, if I follow all the rules and I study and I use my brain and I keep my wits and I'm responsible, these are second order things because they will lead to higher order things. I'll get more out of life. I'll get more pieces of chocolate in the end, basically, right? That's what it means to say it's a second order value. Because after all, this is the most philosophical or metaphysical point here, since contemplating the universals, like mathematical relations, right, in order to become more acquainted with the good and closer to the good. It says those are abstract, non-physical. Non-physical, what's the real point? Universal, not about this contingent person, this contingent body, this contingent place. But universal relations, universal truths. Yeah. So those can't be sort of qualitatively good for me the way eating a piece of chocolate is. So the question is, what Glaucon, who's kind of essentialist himself, a young man, likes to live, likes to dance, and he's asking Socrates, look, what is the state in your own mind, the feeling state that's the good thing about justice? I know how I feel when I'm dancing. I know how I feel when I'm eating chocolate. Right? I know what's good about it, but what is good about being just that way? How is it a good experience? And that's a really tough question. the right answer in a nutshell is that they're really talking about, I mean, this word itself, some people might argue about where you're going to deploy ataraxia. Um, uh, it's important in Epicurean studies. It's a Stoic idea. The idea is satisfaction. That's notice that's the transcendence of the bipolarity of good and evil, getting out of the cycle of craving and satisfaction. And if you're noticing how similar that is to, for example, Indian thinking, that's on purpose because it is, and it's not contingent. And we know a lot more about the connections between those two regions now than we used to. Now, a third bullet point, and this is one of the three that's sort of called an argument. And I don't think it is one at all in this case. That is, Socrates says, well, look, you may experience the good of material pleasure. Some have experienced that. Some have experienced that and the good of the pleasure of honor, of value from honor and reputation. He says those people can tell you which one of those is better, but only someone who's experienced all three can tell you about which of the three is the better. And of course, then once you're a lover of truth and you're studying truth, at that point, of course, you just are philosophers. That's what the definition of a philosopher is. And he says, so those people, the ones who have experienced oligarchy, timarchy, and aristocracy, the ones who know the pleasures of the body, know the pleasures of honor and status, and know the pleasures of meditating on the good, they will tell you that the best thing is to meditate on the good. But as I say at the end of the slide, that's actually not an argument at all. It's actually, he's just saying, well, I got to tell you, the people who have studied math a lot are really telling you, it's a much, much better pleasure than, the bake-off. I mean, it doesn't go through. But, that's the thing, as thinking back 40 years ago when I was first being taught about Plato in a classroom, we sort of marched through and we had to learn these arguments. And what's this argument? And what's the counter argument? What's the counter argument? And we just sort of be very kind of formal and cookie cutter about all of that. And the fact is that it's like the man says, it's all one. There's a sort of philosophy and you learn to apply it. And it's not these logic chopping arguments that it looks like on the surface. This is something I've been emphasizing on this one. Again, we're coming to the end of the semester, so I like people to know about this. Socrates says here in book 9 that, these so-called pleasures of the body, they're mostly just relief from suffering. I mean, you say, drinking water is a pleasure, but drinking water is a pleasure because you're thirsty and so on. And then the thing that relieved the suffering, of course, is something then that we can get strung out on that. We can come to be dependent on that. Or as soon as the satisfaction fades, then the suffering comes back even stronger than it did before. And this, again, is the cycle of craving and satisfaction. And the satisfaction on that teaching, the satisfaction is just as bad as the craving. The material, physical satisfaction, that feeling is just as much a part of this dialectic of seduction into the slavery of the cycle of craving and satisfaction as the suffering itself, the craving. It's all suffering. It's all dukkha is the word. Now, again, Plato's writing, actually, I'm sure that if people have been picking up on this, well, this guy that's reading has like a Buddhist interpretation of Plato a little bit here. You're probably thinking, yeah, that's the way it has to go. It has to go from India to Greece. But that's not at all clear. Some of the recent scholarship, and I really recommend it because it's fascinating, after the Alexandrian conquest at the end of the 4th century, which is a little bit late for Buddhism and Jainism. Some of these historians making the point, I have to strain on that one. But in any event, by at least the end of the Alexandrian conquest at the end of the 4th century, you had large amounts of connections between philosophers. Alexander actually had a contingent of philosophers with him. And there was a huge, vital philosophical scene in India at that time. Remember, the Buddhists didn't know they were the Buddhists or anything. It was just this big community, this big culture. So these are recognizably what you call axial age. When is the axial age? It's from about the 6th to the 4th century, the middle of the first millennium. And we find also in China, Confucius and editing the books, for example, the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tse. And so the Greeks are right in that. As I started off talking about the top of this slide, I can do it. I can use Buddhist language and I can pretty much parse a lot of Plato. You don't want to be obtuse about that and too formulaic, but it's not your imagination, it's real. So last bullet point, as I mentioned before, the Greeks and the Jewish tradition sort of come together really mostly in the 1st century BCE. And you get these waves of messianic thinking and would-be messiahs and the emergence of Jesus. But we tend to think of maybe that kind of monotheistic thinking as somehow completely different from Eastern thinking. The Christian or Muslim believer will see the Asian as a sort of more of a secular philosopher kind of person, I think. But there's a huge connection here. Those are all mental formations that we should think our way out of. Let's see if I have another slide. Yes. Now, the other thing here, and this is a problem in doing commentaries on both book 8 and book 9, because they both have a bunch of crazy math. There's crazy math all through Plato and some really crazy logic too. Sometimes you can make sense of it, sometimes you can't. Performing a number of arithmetical computations, which are related in the text, Socrates concludes in book 9 that the philosopher is 729 times happier than the tyrant. He puts a number on it. And he explains these. And there's a whole literature of people who know a lot of math and geometry and stuff. I mean, okay. So there is a long series of calculations. The amazing translator C.D.C. Reeve, I think, he sounds like he had a handle on all this. And these aren't just for show. I mean, these must be real calculations that really had some sort of significance for Plato. He is, like Pythagoreans, some kind of numerologist. Will we ever really know what this is and how this works? I don't know, maybe. Does it matter? Not as much, because the second bullet point, the larger point here is just that, the point of the good, of the reality of the good being whatever it is that creates the conditions where we live in a cosmos where there are formally organized things, categories of things, properties. And so it follows from that, Plato thinks that there really is some kind of number. He's going to try and derive it. Whether he can derive it or not is one thing. But again, the real point here is, according to him, and again, following from Pythagoreanism here a bit, the world really is made out of numeric objects somehow, integers. And so it is explainable. Maybe this is like Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, that everything must have a reason. Plato sort of thinks something like that, because he thinks that you can give a mathematical description of everything. So last point, he says in book 7, when they're talking about that final training for the philosopher, he says we don't have a good training in solids. It's supposed to go from study of lines to planes to solids, and then the solids have to do with the movement of celestial bodies. And Plato says, look, science can be mathematical. So what he's claiming when he says that the philosopher is 729 times happier than the tyrant, I mean, the larger point, if we don't want to get lost in the bushes, is that he thinks there really is a number. He does think that. He might be wrong about that. I mean, we're just trying to understand what his philosophy is, but that's what he thinks. And there is some kind of number. We could express just about anything, perhaps quantitatively or in mathematical form. Maybe that's a way of putting it, which puts him in with modern rationalists and cognitivists. Some things are never new under the sun. Yeah, that's the end of it. Stop the share. Okay. So again, just a very basic introduction to Republic Book 9. The goal being to show always how this central idea of form matter distinction, the metaphysical idea of the interaction of form and matter, is what is at the heart of Plato's philosophy always. And so now next we will come to this very beautiful concluding book 10 of Plato's Republic. So join me in that. I'm going to, we'll have that for you soon. Okay.